Good afternoon. My name is Dave McCann. I run engineering for a set of AWS services that include migration services, Marketplace and Data Exchange, and a pair of services that we call control services, which are Control Tower and Service Catalog. And today I'd like to give you a quick update on how we help you, our customer, set up a landing zone and then provision into that landing zone third-party software that can help you scale, innovate, and run your business better on the AWS cloud. Now, at a macro level, AWS has built out over 175 services to help you as a customer innovate faster, transform your business, and as you reduce costs and modernize your application portfolio, over time you're going to migrate more and more of your applications onto AWS. And when you do that, you also want to have confidence that you have control and governance controls over software and applications. And ultimately, you want to be more innovative and yet reduce cost. And to do so, you're going to be using a lot of your AWS native services, applications, and software from a number of third-party services. Now, there are different drivers for you, our customers, to move to the cloud. Most people start with something around development, agility, and innovation. Sometimes a customer has a major application around which they want to transform a business, or how their business is competing with their competitor, or how a government agency is servicing their taxpayers. And at the same time, you may want to use cloud for improved resilience, improved security, using our regions and availability zones around the world. And right now, particularly in time of economic distress imposed by COVID in economies around the world, there may be a heightened emphasis on cost optimization. And behind the scenes, there's a constant trend to moving out of data centers or to companies going global with mergers and acquisition. So there's a series of reasons on why you'll be both modernizing your applications and migrating to the cloud. And today, as your customers grapple with COVID impact, you may be balancing between an aspiration to transform, an aspiration to modernize some of your applications, and yet receiving instructions from your CEO or from your governor of your state or your country saying we also need to optimize costs. And so today you have a particular challenge of resolving tensions between cost optimization, innovation, and modernization. So I'm going to cover how you do some of that today and the tools that we have that let you get there. Now, over the last few years, we've built up a lot of history on helping tens of thousands of organizations move onto the AWS cloud. And there are common patterns and experiences that we can confidently give you as advice around building applications in what we call the cloud native way, moving towards microservices, moving into small teams, developing in a modern methodology, which means fast feature build, frequent code deployments, very low change failure rates, and so really modernizing your whole software development lifecycle on your modern applications. But a typical organization could have 200 to 1,000 applications, and you're also going to be migrating applications from on-premise to the cloud, possibly modernizing them as you move them, and you'll be bringing software from hundreds of software vendors. And frankly, what we also observe is you'll be retiring older applications and modernizing on the cloud new replacement applications. And if you think about modernization of your application portfolio, what we see customers telling us is that there's an increased use of software as a service, and there are now over 5,000 funded and backed software as a service vendors in the world. And you're also going to be moving to software from many vendors that is now provisioned in a container world, or you may be developing in a serverless model. So you're going to be using modern techniques to deploy, and to do all of that at speed involves transforming a lot of your processes. Now, to help you do that, we've actually built out a portfolio of what we call 15 management and governance services, where we help you set up a set of environments, what we call the enablement of your landing zone. And then you're going to provision resources on top of that landing zone. And then we build out a set of tools for you to operate those applications and those services at very cost-efficient models, which is where you yield a lot of your cost optimization over time. And I'm not going to cover all of those 15 services today. I'm going to focus in particular on the top row around something we call Control Tower, which is highly dependent on organizations. And I'm also going to focus down on the second layer in the provisioning layer of how Marketplace allows you to entitle and provision third-party software on top of your landing zone. I gave a separate talk at reInvent on operations and management and governance, and I will not be covering that area today. Now, as you do this kind of innovation, you want to be thinking that we want to make it easy for you to allow your distributed teams to discover and to use the right software for the right project. And as you move to small distributed teams, different teams are going to be making choices on software at different points in that team maturity. And you want to be able to provision the software into the right accounts, give them the right resources, for which we use things like Control Tower and rules in AWS organizations. And then we'll also show you and discuss how you can use Service Catalog to apply rules and constraints around who can use what resources. But ultimately, the provisioning of software and data will come out of Marketplace. And for data, we now have something called Data Exchange. So I'll be covering that kind of area today at a little further depth. Ultimately, what you end up doing is you end up building what we would call a cloud operating model. And to do that, you'll be using a set of our services in conjunction with other software vendors that you may have chosen in something that we would call a cloud operating framework. And that framework has to balance a tension between the desire for your developers to go fast and have freedom to build in an agile development model, and to give your teams the empowerment to move at speed. But at the same time, as perhaps a large company, a regulated entity, or a government agency, you want to make sure that you've still wrapped your teams with the right levels of guidelines and what we call guardrails around what those teams can do. How do we balance agility and governance? The product that we most recently released in order to make that easy for you is something called AWS Control Tower. And the idea behind Control Tower is that you're going to land a set of applications down on your landing zone. And in landing those applications on your landing zone, you're going to have control of how those applications get permissioned in to the accounts you grant out to your teams. Now, that involves vending or providing accounts to teams. And if you think of many organizations having dev accounts, test accounts, and prod accounts, and with you having perhaps a dozen or 100 teams, you can end up with hundreds of accounts, and you want a multi-account model where it makes it easy for you as a company to provision resources to all these distributed teams. And that was the basis on which we have built AWS Control Tower. Control Tower integrates in with at least 8 other AWS services. So IAM, organizations, systems manager, AWS config, CloudTrail. We've actually done some of the integration work. And where in the past setting up a landing zone could have taken 6 weeks manually, in Control Tower, you can now set up a secure landing zone in a matter of minutes and hours, depending on the number of accounts and teams for which you're going to be setting up guardrails and guidelines. So Control Tower is a governance console to publish accounts and policies around those accounts. Now, once you've published accounts and you attach resources to those accounts, then you get into the determination of what other software to provision into those accounts. And you'll be looking at tools for management and governance. You'll be looking at tools for security and compliance. And as we look across the world, part of the job of the Marketplace organization is to make it really easy for your developers and your cloud engineering teams to easily find and provision the best software that we've determined runs well in AWS, and work with those ISVs to make it really easy for your teams to entitle and provision that software into your teams and let your teams go quickly. And that's the kind of repeatable simplification that we're doing on an ongoing basis. What you end up with as a customer is what Intuit would call, and I gave a talk with them at reInvent, a service management framework. That's a customer term for a framework which is a collection of software that the customer chooses using AWS management and governance tools, perhaps in combination with 10, 20, or 30 vendors that your organization may choose to use in conjunction with AWS, and other perhaps on-prem environments that you may use for your entire server and application fleet. And every organization is going to have a slightly different framework model depending on where you've come from and how fast you're moving onto AWS. From a CIO portal that could be something like Apptio, through the various developer toolkits coming from a GitHub or an Atlassian. And this particular customer had chosen ServiceNow for their non-technical users to provision, or were using monitoring from New Relic and using SIEM tools like Splunk and alerting tools like PagerDuty. And each customer you will choose the tools you want to choose. So as you journey to the cloud and you want to go faster and you also want to reduce costs, how do we help you do that as you modernize your application portfolio? This is where the Marketplace is an application catalog of resources that we make it incredibly easy for you to find and use in a repeatable and consistent model. And we want you to be able to find, test, perhaps bring licenses you have, or to procure new third-party software out into teams around your organization. Now, over the last few years, we've taken feedback from hundreds of customers that every CIO is managing an application portfolio and a vendor portfolio. Procurement is partnering with the CIO and managing the vendor relationships, but the architects, the CIO, the VP of applications, perhaps the VP of infrastructure, have got a cohort of vendors, and there's concentration of spend, and there's concentration of preference. And what we find in very large companies is there could be as many as 500 vendors, and in a small company it could be 30 to 50 vendors, and a mid-sized organization it could be 200 to 300. And as you move to the cloud, you're going to modernize that vendor portfolio, and there's going to be quite a bit of change. Now, who consumes software in an organization is very dependent on size and role. Your cloud engineering team and your infrastructure team are going to be choosing software across a set of technical domains: storage, networking, DevOps tools, identity and access tools, BI tools, common tools for infrastructure below the application layer. Your CISO for the organization owns security decisions, works with infrastructure, and we find many companies have got a dozen security vendors, but as they move to the cloud, they're going to simplify and modernize their choice of security vendor. And in Marketplace, one of the most popular categories is security. Your big data team are very focused on data aggregation across application, are choosing a different set of vendors. And then your developers, your application directors, your VPs of applications in large companies may own portfolios of applications for different parts of the company. And the challenge this presents for procurement, legal, and IT finance is that very small procurement and finance teams are servicing dozens, hundreds, and perhaps thousands of developers who are choosing dozens of different products. How do we simplify that for you? So we simplify it for you by building a catalog, a digital catalog that gives you a common experience globally. And so you could be an international organization with software development teams in Europe, in India, in South America, in North America, and you want a global catalog that your engineers can use. So Marketplace is that digital catalog. We're adding software vendors to it every day. We have several APIs for the vendors to use, whether they're publishing an AME, whether maybe publishing software to a container, or whether they're actually integrating software as a service that they manage under their resources. So we present different API choices for these developers, and then as they publish their product lines, we give them architectural advice on how to package and provision, and indeed how to price, so that it makes it easy for you, the customer, to launch in your accounts. And recently we just launched Marketplace in China, we've launched Marketplace in Cape Town and in Milan, and we integrate everything onto the billing experience. Now, I talked earlier about technical domains, and whether it's networking, security, or storage, there are popular vendors that commonly show up across all our customers, and now these vendors are publishing the newest versions of their software, such as a Trend Micro, or a Fortinet, or a Palo Alto in security, over to a Cisco in networking, Splunk in monitoring, and vendors are publishing new versions all the time. We're also starting to publish application software in industry marketplaces, focusing on healthcare and life sciences, media and entertainment, or financial services, where we have FICO, who's a leader in fraud management, publishing their SaaS solutions all the way into Marketplace. So your application teams, your BI teams, your security teams can find and subscribe. Now, there are many deployment options, and as you modernize your portfolio, you may start bringing over software that is still packaged as a server, and you'll find it deployable as a machine image. However, as software vendors learn how to use ELB and ALB and Lambda functions, you'll find that a lot of the software vendors take their server architectures and we wrap them in CloudFormation templates, and now you can launch a full CloudFormation template right out of Marketplace, and we take you right over to the CloudFormation console. More and more vendors are modernizing to SaaS. Splunk started as an AME, they became Splunk Cloud, so you'll find vendors that journey. Trend Micro started with deep security and have now moved to a cloud unified portfolio. So vendors may have multiple deployment types in the catalog, and we have machine learning models provisioned all the way into SageMaker. And then, of course, we now deploy software to both ECS and EKS, companies like Tibco, who took their products and repackaged for containers. Now, we also want to simplify the time it takes to both contract and entitle. And a lot of software in catalog in Marketplace is actually free, and so it's open source software, and you'll find everything in the EC2 console like CentOS, Debian, and Ubuntu. You'll find vendors that allow you to bring a license you already own, and then you'll find a lot of vendors that enable to free trial and do multi-year contracts. And 2 years ago, we launched the ability for you to negotiate directly with a vendor and receive what we call a private negotiated contract under something called private offer. So we're simplifying and modernizing this experience across hundreds of vendors. So we're trying to make the procurement and automation of provisioning as simple as the development of software. So think of this as agile procurement. And we are having to educate your procurement teams, your legal teams, your IT finance teams on how they need to move at the speed of your agile development teams. And that provokes new challenges for procurement. How do they get a vendor approved as quickly as you can do a sprint? How do they understand that you want to subscribe and that your engineers can subscribe to a product? And how does that subscription work if procurement still needs to have visibility and they're using a procurement tool? And post-procurement, IT finance wants to know, how are things monitored and tracked, and are things tagged, and where does spend show up? So these are questions that we have to solve for. And over the last few years, as Marketplace has become widely adopted with over 1.5 million subscriptions in over 290,000 active customers around the world, we've had to solve something like private Marketplace, where you can set rules on what vendors you expose to your developers, or where your procurement team negotiates directly with the vendor using private offers. One of the hardest parts is legal wanting to negotiate quickly and consistently. And we worked with a consortium of our customers on our advisory board to describe and design a standard contract. And we have now 2 standard contracts, an enterprise standard contract and a standard contract, where 114 terms can be embraced by the buyer and can be embraced by the ISV. And this means that both parties start negotiating on common terms, and we cut months off the negotiation cycle. Now we're doing a lot of work around visibility and transparency, how things get tagged, and tags inherited from the EC2 instance type that you provision to, and working with tagging all the way into Cost Explorer, and then integrated into partner vendors such as Cloud Health and Aptio Cloudability. So we're essentially automating the full supply chain end to end. And we're doing this by publishing APIs for the ISV, and those APIs get optimized by the ISV. We allow a workflow through Marketplace right into the console of your developers. And Marketplace started as a site, but now we've actually put Marketplace offers directly in the Redshift console, the SageMaker console, the ECS console, the EKS console. So we're putting the selection of software where your teams are. And then you also have relationships with consulting partners. And so We've actually now built out a discovery API so that consulting partners that you prefer to work with, such as Rackspace or WWT or Computer Center or SHI or Presidio, hundreds of consulting partners, can also publish and quote that software because you prefer to use them. So this is full automation of a supply chain to move to what you might always call procurement ops. And you've heard of DevOps and SecOps, and now people have started to talk about ProcOps. So how do we make procurement work at the speed of a DevOps world? This ultimately lands to your benefit with companies like Rackspace, who could be engaged with a client, and Rackspace have built skills over 70 software vendors, and Rackspace wants to engage with those software vendors, provision them into the customer account. And so we've done work with Rackspace, with dozens of vendors, so that Rackspace clients can actually experience software provisioned by Rackspace into their accounts, where Rackspace has actually become the managed service provider, does the integration through their Onica subsidiary, and this is an example of where we're touching the experience from end to end. Now, we've done all of this automation for software. What about data? Applications use data. Applications may use third-party software plus homegrown code, but the data industry is a $150 billion data industry. And many of our customers in retail, in finance, in healthcare, may be bringing in external software and external data. So in reInvent last year, we took the concepts of Marketplace and we extended it to a brand new service that we launched called AWS Data Exchange, with the idea of allowing you to subscribe and provide data to your teams in the same way you do software. Now, with Data Exchange, what we learned was many of our customers already ingest data from many data providers. And in the case of a bank, or an insurer, or a healthcare company, or a pharma company, they could be ingesting data from 10, 20, 100, 200 data providers using 200 different APIs. And so the actual effort of pulling in data from 200 different APIs costs you, the customer, time and delay. And what our customers wanted was a consistent model. And what we decided to offer the data suppliers was a consistent API. So the data subscriber at a drug company can find the data, ingest the data, provision it quickly into their S3 bucket, and not have to go through some centralized team that's taking a long time with one particular vendor. So the idea behind Data Exchange, same concept as Marketplace, but applied to data. Now, as we've launched this and we've populated the data sets, we've found strong interest from financial institutions, from pharmaceutical companies doing research on COVID right now, to retailers who want to do marketing and location-based targeting, and to media and entertainment who want to provide recommendation around content, all the way over to public sector institutions that right now are grappling with contact tracing and all the stress on government organizations. And so Data Exchange publishes data very quickly, and right now we have over 2,000 data sets published in Data Exchange from over 100 data vendors. So in healthcare, we're already publishing COVID data sets from people that change healthcare or navigating cancer, who are also publishing data around the intersection of COVID and cancer. Over into financial services with people like Experian and Dun & Bradstreet. Over into the content space with IMDb or TrueFactor, and then lots of data in the public sector arena. So we're simplifying the flow of data in the same way that we're simplifying the provisioning of software. This now means that you have management, you have governance, and at the same time you have agility of point-click subscribe for your distributed teams. So if you bring this together and say, how do we help you innovate? How do we help you modernize? And how do we help you have control? We've observed and we're enabling you to bring software, applications, and data at speed by setting all your policies up in Control Tower, applying constraints and policies to those teams, build an operating model with the best third-party tools around performance management, security, and governance and spend management, And on that journey, I think I want you to believe that you're going to retire at least 20% of your applications. Companies like Aon Insurance would tell you that they're retiring more than 20% of their applications as they modernize to the cloud. And as you move to the cloud, you're actually going to have more visibility, not less visibility, because everything can be instrumented, tagged, metered, put into daily billing, translated into spend management, and made visible either in AWS cost and usage reports or into the cloud health and the Apptio cloud abilities that may be used by your IT finance teams and integrated into your procurement systems such as SAP Ariba and Coupa. So we're taking all of the friction out of the way that your teams contract and provision. And by removing time as friction and complexity as friction, we actually require you to use less people to manage more resources in a dynamic way, which actually allows you to pivot more of your resources to being application development and not operations. So we decrease your operating costs, we increase your capacity to develop, and we flip your in perpetuity licensing into metered and provision billing so that you can decrease your operating expenses and therefore yield cost optimization even as you innovate faster. These are the ways that we transform your experience and allow you to innovate on the cloud and to modernize your application portfolio, modernize your vendor portfolio, and reduce costs. Thank you very much.